The heavy, deliberate thump of 3 knuckles striking my front door did not sound like a request, it sounded like an execution. It was nearly midnight when that demanding rhythm echoed through my apartment. Cutting through the quiet hum of the city, I already knew who was standing on the other side before I even turned the brass handle. My father did not believe in warning shots, nor did he believe in asking for permission. When I opened the door, he simply shoved past me into the entryway, bringing the chill of the winter air along with his overpowering scent of expensive cologne. He did not offer a greeting, nor did he look me in the eyes as he marched toward my kitchen island. With a cold, calculated motion, he dropped a thick leather folder onto the clean surface and delivered his ultimatum without a shred of hesitation. He demanded $850,000 by tomorrow at noon, speaking as if he were ordering a coffee rather than shaking my entire world. When I opened that folder, my vision blurred as I stared at my own name forged perfectly at the bottom of a high-interest loan document. Looking at that flawless imitation of my signature, a strange, frozen calmness washed over me, replacing the initial shock. For my entire life, I had been the reliable cornerstone of my family, the one who quietly fixed every disaster and absorbed every blow. But staring at that ink, I realized that my compliance had officially expired, and my father had no idea he was about to face the consequences. People love to preach about how blood is thicker than water, but in our household, family was nothing more than a transactional currency, and I was the unlimited bank account. My name is Julian, and I spent my childhood in an affluent suburb of Boston where maintaining a flawless public image was far more important than actual honesty. My father, Arthur Vance, was a man who ruled both his commercial real estate empire and his household with an iron fist. Our family dinners were never casual conversations. They were strategic performance reviews, where every piece of advice carried a hidden interest rate. My younger sister Chloe learned how to navigate his volatile temperament early on, mastering the art of wide eyes, trembling lips, and perfectly timed tears. Whenever Chloe stumbled or made a mistake, Arthur would stop the world to shield her from the fallout of her own choices. Whenever I achieved something monumental through hard work, he would merely nod and warn me not to become arrogant. Our mother did her best to inject some genuine warmth into our lives, but after she passed away during my college years, the entire house froze over. Silence became the primary rule of survival, and total obedience was the only form of affection Arthur was capable of giving. I was barely 20 when I started balancing multiple academic scholarships just to pay my own way through school, while Chloe was gifted a luxury vehicle just to keep her motivated. Arthur used to tell me that I was built for the storm, but what he really meant was that I was durable enough to be exploited. A decade passed, and I managed to build my own independent financial consulting firm in the heart of the city. My office had floor-to-ceiling glass windows and a reputation that I carved out through relentless 90-hour workweeks and absolute integrity. My hard-won success did not bring me a sense of personal pride. It simply made me an attractive target for my family once again. Arthur would arrogantly brag to his wealthy business partners about his brilliant son who managed portfolios for top-tier executives. But our private phone calls were entirely different. He never called to ask about my life or my well-being, only to demand that I clear up another mess. I constantly minimized his behavior, telling myself that supporting family was an obligation, but that illusion shattered into dust on that freezing winter evening, as Arthur paced around my kitchen, explaining that Chloe's husband had ruined their finances with a series of disastrous investments. My anger began to harden into absolute clarity. He casually explained that they owed nearly $1 million to some very unforgiving creditors, and he expected me to quietly liquidate my assets to resolve it. When I questioned how my name ended up on the guarantee forms, he did not even blink or apologize for stealing my identity. He just looked at me with that old, familiar authority that assumed I would eventually bow to his pressure. He arrogantly reminded me that family does not abandon each other when things get difficult, and that was the exact moment I smiled a small, dangerous smile. For the very first time in my 30 years of existence, the fear of losing their approval completely evaporated from my heart. After he left my apartment, I poured a glass of whiskey, stared out at the flashing city lights, and realized that the game had officially changed. If Arthur wanted to play a game of absolute control, I was going to show him what happens when the rules are turned against him. The following morning, my smartphone began vibrating violently, before the sun had even cleared the horizon, displaying alternating missed calls from Chloe and Arthur. I chose not to answer, letting the screen illuminate the dark room over and over until it finally went entirely silent. When I eventually returned my sister's call hours later, her voice sounded entirely rehearsed, filled with breathless panic and shallow apologies. She begged me not to be furious, claiming her husband just made a minor error and promising they would return every single dollar. It was the exact same script she had utilized when I quietly covered her university tuition, bought her first property, and paid off her maxed-out credit cards. When I calmly informed her that our father had legally forged my identity to secure the loan, the phone line went completely dead for several seconds. She finally whispered that Arthur only did it to save her family, casually brushing off criminal fraud as if it were just a quirky personality trait. By the afternoon, Arthur bypassed my security and marched directly into my corporate office. Looking like a man who owned the building, he demanded the funds immediately, entirely indifferent to the fact that my employees were openly staring at his aggressive behavior. When I firmly told him that he did not have the right to threaten me in my own place of business, he simply smirked. He arrogantly reminded me that I had the capital, sneering that I should remember who provided the roof over my head. The deep humiliation and the decades of psychological conditioning melted away in that single, quiet moment, leaving behind something incredibly cold, sharp, and focused. After his dramatic departure, I sat alone in the dimming light of my office, listening to the distant sounds of traffic below. I meticulously reviewed every single check I had ever written for them, realizing that every hollow thank you note was just an invitation to demand more. The suffocating guilt that I had carried around like a heavy anchor for my entire life suddenly broke apart, revealing a profound sense of emotional detachment. That night, I used an old spare key to enter my late mother's preserved home, searching for something grounded amid the chaos. Beneath the dust of her old writing desk, I uncovered her personal leather journals, filled with her elegant, precise handwriting. One specific sentence caught my eye, warning that generosity without firm boundaries is nothing more than voluntary emotional slavery. I closed the book with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling a flawless strategy falling into place as I stepped back into the freezing night. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of intense, calculated preparation while I maintained a perfectly normal exterior for my clients. Every manipulative phrase Arthur had ever weaponized against me started playing on a continuous loop inside my mind, fueling my determination. I contacted my primary corporate attorney late that evening, instructing her to immediately initiate a total lockdown of my entire financial portfolio. She did not waste time asking for explanations, simply inquiring whether I wanted this transition to be handled quietly or through public channels. I chose the quiet route for the time being, wanting the initial impact to hit them in absolute secrecy. Within a matter of hours, an impenetrable financial firewall was erected around every single trust asset and real estate holding linked to my social security number. I officially revoked Arthur's authorized signatory access from the Family Charitable Foundation, a privilege he had abused for his own tax advantages for years. Simultaneously, I compiled a massive digital archive of every wire transfer, tuition payment, and temporary loan I had provided them over the last decade. It was an undeniable paper trail, proving that I had been single-handedly financing their luxurious lifestyle while receiving nothing but disrespect. When my attorney called me at midnight to confirm that the changes were permanent and irreversible, I told her I was completely ready. The next morning, I packed a heavy cardboard box with physical copies of every single piece of financial evidence I had gathered. On the very top of the pile, I placed a typed letter stating that control without basic honesty is just structural manipulation. I explicitly wrote that this was not an act of emotional revenge, but rather a long overdue lesson in personal accountability. I left the sealed box on the polished table in my apartment foyer, directly beneath a framed photograph of Arthur receiving a prestigious civic award. He was wearing that exact same predatory smile he always used, right before he completely backed someone into a corner. I stood there staring at his face, remembering how he had always referred to Chloe as his fragile masterpiece, and to me as his ultimate insurance policy. By the time the morning sun hit the glass towers of the city, my bags were packed, and I was holding a one-way ticket. At exactly noon, my remote doorbell application captured two distinct shadows approaching my apartment door through the secure camera feed. Arthur did not bother knocking this time. He simply pounded on the wood with the entitlement of a man who had never been denied entry. Through the speaker, his muffled voice demanded that I unlock the door immediately, citing our supposed agreement about the outstanding debt. When the apartment remained completely silent, his angry gaze shifted downward toward the glass panel where the plain brown box was sitting. He pulled a master key from his pocket, assuming that his status granted him access to any room he desired to enter. The camera recorded every movement as he stepped inside, tossed his own debt folder onto the counter, and roughly tore open the packing tape. The sorted legal documents, bank statements, and forged signatures spilled out across the marble counter. Like a public confession of his crimes, his hands began to visibly shake as he realized he was holding the complete undoing of his Carefully constructed authority. At the bottom of the box, he discovered a small, silver flash drive labeled with the single instruction to play the audio file. When he connected it to the countertop speaker, my calm, recorded voice filled the empty apartment, echoing off the bare walls. I told him that while he taught me how to operate a business, he also taught me exactly how to dismantle one. I made it clear that we were officially finished, and that the financial safety net he relied on was gone forever. The audio file concluded with the gentle, rhythmic sound of ocean waves, recorded from the distant coastline where I was currently sitting. Through the live camera feed, I watched Arthur slowly sink onto a bar stool, looking entirely deflated under the crushing weight of his own actions. My sister turned to him in total panic, desperately asking what their next move was, but he could only whisper that they had lost me. For the first time in his dominant life, there was no command, no strategy, and no lecture. There was only total defeat. Thousands of miles away, I sat on the covered deck of a small coastal cottage, watching the gray Atlantic tide crash against the rocks. My laptop screen was constantly updating with notifications from my legal team, confirming that every asset was secured and the audit of Arthur's firm was underway. By the following afternoon, the corporate fallout was catastrophic, forcing Arthur to step down from his own board of directors in absolute disgrace. I received a frantic text message from Chloe, but I chose to let her experience the harsh reality of the silence she had forced upon me for years. Months passed, and the constant knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for decades finally began to completely dissolve. The slow, deliberate pace of the coastal town agreed with me, and I began volunteering my time to help local residents navigate financial literacy. One quiet evening, my phone rang from an unlisted number, and when I answered, the heavy silence on the line was instantly recognizable. Arthur spoke with a voice that was entirely stripped of its usual booming power, telling me that he finally understood why I had to leave. He admitted that he saw my mother's unbreakable spirit in me that night, confessing that she would have been proud of my strength to walk away. For the very first time in my entire life, I heard genuine, unfiltered regret in his voice rather than a calculated performance designed to manipulate me. We did not fix our fractured relationship in that single conversation, but we established a new foundation built on absolute honesty rather than financial obligation. As I ended the call and listened to the soothing sound of the dark ocean, I realized that true power never comes from forcing others to submit. It comes from having the courage to finally let go. Please subscribe my channel if you loved your parents.